There's a particular kind of silence that settles over rural New England just after sunset. It's the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing, where the rustle of leaves sounds amplified, where a car's headlights cutting through the darkness feels like an intrusion into something ancient and undisturbed. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, this silence became something else entirely for the communities along the Connecticut River Valley. It became the sound of waiting. Waiting for news that never came. Waiting for answers that remained just beyond reach. Waiting in the dark, wondering if the person who had already taken 7 lives might still be out there, driving those same quiet roads, watching. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Connecticut River Valley Killer, a true crime documentary. Now let's begin. Tonight, we're going to talk about one of New England's most haunting unsolved cases. Not because it's filled with shocking details or gruesome revelations, but because of what it represents. 7 women, their lives ended too soon. One survivor who carries both her scars and her story with extraordinary courage. And a question that has lingered for nearly 5 decades. Who was the person who moved through these communities like a shadow, and where did they go? This is a story told not in sensational terms, but in the measured cadence of facts, testimony, and the weight of time. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin at the beginning. In a small New Hampshire town on an autumn afternoon when the leaves were turning and the air carried the first hints of coming winter. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. The Connecticut River stretches for more than 250 miles through New England, forming much of the border between Vermont and New Hampshire. It's the longest river in the region, winding through forests and farmland, past small towns where everyone knows everyone, where doors often went unlocked, and where the pace of life moved slower than in the cities to the south. This was particularly true in the 1970s and early 1980s, when the communities along the river valley maintained a certain innocence about the world beyond their borders. New Hampshire had historically been one of the safest states in the nation. Crime rates were low. Violent crime was even rarer. The towns along the Connecticut River Valley were the kinds of places where children played outside until dark, where hitchhiking wasn't considered particularly dangerous, and where a woman could stop at a convenience store late at night without much thought. This sense of security, this belief in the fundamental safety of their world, would soon be shattered in ways that residents could never have imagined. Catherine Von Milliken, who went by Kathy, was 27 years old in October of 1978. She worked for a publishing company in New London, New Hampshire, and was known among her friends and colleagues as an artist, a photographer, and a passionate birdwatcher. She was also a national sailing champion, someone who loved the outdoors and found peace in the natural world. On the afternoon of October 24th, a Tuesday, Kathy left work with a specific plan in mind. A friend had told her about rare ducks that had been spotted at the Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve in New London, and she wanted to photograph them while the light was still good. The preserve was a quiet place, tucked away but not isolated. Other visitors were there that afternoon, people who later told investigators they'd seen a young woman with a camera, focused on her work, moving through the area with the careful attention of someone who knew what she was looking for. Kathy's Volkswagen Rabbit was parked near the preserve, visible from the road during routine patrols. Everything seemed normal, unremarkable, the kind of peaceful autumn afternoon that people in New England treasure before winter settles in. But Kathy didn't come home that evening. When she was reported missing, police remembered seeing her car during their patrol the previous day. A search began, though in those early hours, there was likely more confusion than alarm. Perhaps she'd lost track of time. Perhaps her car had broken down somewhere. Perhaps there was a simple, mundane explanation that would resolve itself. The next day, October 25th, Kathy's body was found in a wooded area off Route 11, just yards from where she'd last been seen. where she'd been photographing those rare ducks. She had been stabbed multiple times, at least 29 wounds according to the medical examiner. The violence of her death stood in stark contrast to the peacefulness of the setting where she died. At the time, investigators treated Kathy's murder as a tragic but isolated incident. There was no immediate reason to suspect it was part of something larger. Murder was rare enough in this part of New Hampshire. The idea of a serial killer operating in their community would have seemed almost absurd. And so the case was investigated, leads were pursued. But as weeks turned to months and no arrest was made, Kathy Milliken's murder began to settle into the category of unsolved crimes. Her family grieved. Her friends tried to make sense of the senseless. And life in the Connecticut River Valley continued, though perhaps with a slightly diminished sense of security. 3 years passed. 3 years during which the seasons changed, during which life moved forward in its ordinary rhythms. Then, in the summer of 1981, those rhythms were disrupted again. Mary Elizabeth Critchley, known as Betsy, was 37 years old and a student at the University of Vermont. On July 25th, she was hitchhiking from Massachusetts toward Waterbury, Vermont. A friend dropped her off near exit 13 of the Massachusetts Turnpike in Framingham, and Betsy set off to catch a ride north. It was a common enough practice at the time, especially for young people, especially in areas where public transportation was limited and where the culture still maintained a degree of trust between strangers. Betsy never reached Waterbury. 2 weeks later, on August 9th, her body was discovered in a wooded area off Unity Stage Road in Unity, New Hampshire, approximately 80 miles from where she'd last been seen. The location was remote, accessible by dirt roads, the kind of place someone would only know about if they were familiar with the area. Due to the condition of her remains after 2 weeks in the summer heat, the medical examiner was unable to definitively determine a cause of death. But the circumstances of her disappearance, the location where she was found, and the manner in which her body had been left all suggested violence. More than that, they suggested intention. Someone had taken Betsy somewhere. Someone had left her in a place where she might not be found for a long time. Now there were 2 unsolved cases. 2 young women dead under circumstances that shared certain similarities. Both had been in relatively public places when they disappeared. Both had been found in wooded, isolated areas in New Hampshire. Both cases remained frustratingly devoid of clear suspects or obvious motives. But 3 years had passed between the murders. Were they connected? Or was this simply the cruel coincidence of 2 separate tragedies occurring in the same general region? The investigators working these cases didn't have the benefit of hindsight. They didn't know they were looking at the early work of someone who would eventually be linked to at least 7 murders. They were doing their jobs with the information available to them, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing witnesses who had seen nothing unusual, trying to find patterns in what still appeared to be random, isolated events. The communities along the Connecticut River Valley, meanwhile, were beginning to feel something shift. It was subtle at first, a slight increase in wariness, a few more locked doors, a few more warnings to daughters and sisters to be careful, to not walk alone, to be aware of their surroundings. By 1984, that wariness was starting to transform into something closer to fear. Not panic, not yet, but a growing awareness that something was wrong in their valley, something that the authorities couldn't seem to stop or even fully understand. May 30th of that year was a Wednesday. Bernice Courtmanche was 17 years old, a high school student who also worked as a nurse's aide at Sullivan County Nursing Home. She lived in Claremont, New Hampshire, another small town along the river valley, and on that afternoon she had plans to visit her boyfriend in Newport. Bernice was last seen by her boyfriend's mother, and she set out to make the trip by hitchhiking along New Hampshire Route 12. It was a route she'd taken before, a distance of about 10 miles through familiar territory. But Bernice never arrived in Newport. When she didn't show up, she was reported missing, and another search began. This time, though, that search would last for nearly 2 years. Bernice's family waited. They hoped. They tried to maintain some belief that she might still be alive, that she might have run away, that there might be some explanation other than the one that kept creeping into their thoughts late at night. Then, on April 19th, 1986, a fisherman made a grim discovery near the Sugar River in Newport. He found skeletal remains. Forensic examination revealed that these were Bernice's remains, and that she had died from knife wounds to the chest and an injury to her head. Her throat had been slit. The brutality of Bernice's murder, combined with the length of time her body had remained undiscovered, spoke to a level of calculation that was deeply disturbing. Whoever had taken her had chosen a location where she might never be found, and the manner of her death, the multiple stab wounds, the throat wound, all pointed to an attacker who had inflicted this violence with determination and without apparent remorse. 3 murders now, spanning from 1978 to 1984. But the pattern was about to become impossible to ignore, because 1985 and 1986 would bring a cascade of discoveries that would finally force investigators to confront what they were really dealing with. Ellen Ruth Fried was 26 years old in the summer of 1984. She worked as a supervising nurse at Valley Regional Hospital and was known as responsible and dedicated. On the night of July 22nd, around 2 in the morning, Ellen made a stop at Leo's Market in Claremont to use the payphone. She called her sister Heidi, who lived in California, and they talked for about an hour. During that conversation, Ellen mentioned something that would later seem deeply significant. She told her sister that there was a strange car in the parking lot, driving back and forth, circling. At one point, Ellen stepped away from the phone to make sure her own car would start. She returned, finished her conversation with her sister, and hung up. That was the last time anyone spoke to Ellen Fried. Her disappearance triggered another search, but Ellen wasn't found quickly. It wasn't until September 19th, 1985, more than a year after she'd vanished, that her skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area in Kellyville, near Newport. The location was remote, tucked into the forest where few people ventured. Forensic examination revealed evidence of knife wounds, though the condition of the remains limited what investigators could determine with certainty. What was clear, though, was that Ellen had been murdered and her body deliberately placed in a location where it might remain hidden indefinitely. Then, less than a year later, on April 19, 1986, another set of remains was found in Kellyville. These belonged to Eva Morse, and like Ellen Fried's body, Eva's had been left in the woods, within 1,000 feet of where Ellen was discovered. The proximity of these 2 dump sites was impossible to ignore. Whoever had killed these women knew this area. They had used it before. They had returned to it. And now, with multiple bodies being found in similar locations, all bearing the marks of knife wounds, investigators were forced to acknowledge what they had likely suspected for some time. They were dealing with a serial killer. The spring of 1986 marked a turning point in how law enforcement approached these cases. With the discovery of Eva Morse's remains in April, coming so soon after Ellen Fried's body had been found in the same general area, and with Bernice Courtemanche's remains identified that same month, the pieces of a horrifying pattern began to form a clearer picture. Investigators started pulling files, re-examining old cases, looking for connections that might have been missed when each murder was treated as an isolated incident. What they found was disturbing in its consistency. Multiple young women, all in the Connecticut River Valley area. All had disappeared under circumstances that suggested they'd been vulnerable, alone, in places where an opportunistic attacker might strike without witnesses. All had been found, when they were found, in remote wooded areas, often near dirt roads or trails that required local knowledge to navigate. And in the cases where cause of death could be determined, all had died from stab wounds, often multiple wounds, inflicted with what appeared to be calculated brutality. These weren't crimes of passion, weren't fights that escalated. These were deliberate acts of violence committed by someone who had time, who had control over their victims, and who had thought about where to leave them afterward. The geographical pattern was particularly striking. Drawing a rough circle with a radius of about 50 miles, centered on the Claremont and Newport area of New Hampshire, investigators could account for nearly all the disappearances and body recovery sites. This suggested someone who knew the region intimately, someone who understood its back roads and hidden places, someone who could move through it without attracting attention. The Connecticut River Valley wasn't a densely populated urban area where a stranger might easily disappear into crowds. This was a place where unfamiliar faces were noticed, where someone driving slowly or returning repeatedly to certain areas might be remembered. The killer, it seemed, understood this. They knew how to blend in, or they were already part of the fabric of the community. But even as this pattern became clearer, even as investigators began operating under the assumption that these crimes were connected, the identity of the person responsible remained completely elusive. There were no witnesses who had seen anyone with the victims before they disappeared. There was no physical evidence that pointed to a specific individual. The forensic technology of the mid-1980s was far less sophisticated than what we have today. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Security cameras were rare, especially in rural areas. The investigation was forced to rely on traditional detective work. Interviews, tips from the public, painstaking reconstruction of timelines and movements, and the hope that someone, somewhere, knew something that might crack the case open. The communities along the river valley were now deeply afraid. The newspapers had begun covering these cases more extensively. Television news programs were running stories about the Connecticut River Valley murders. People were talking, sharing theories, warning each other to be careful. The sense of safety that had once defined life in this region was gone, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety. Women traveling alone took extra precautions. Parents kept closer watch on their daughters. The locks that had often been left unused were now clicked into place every night. And still, despite all this heightened awareness, despite all the warnings and all the fear, the murders continued. April 15th, 1986, was a Tuesday afternoon. Linda Moore was 36 years old and lived in Saxton's River, Vermont, just across the Connecticut River from the New Hampshire communities where most of the other victims had disappeared. Her home was located near Route 121, in an area that wasn't particularly isolated but wasn't densely populated either. That afternoon, Linda was doing yard work outside her house. It was approximately 2 in the afternoon. Her husband was at work. Linda was alone. When her husband returned home around 4 o'clock, he found a scene of horror. Linda was dead in their living room, and she had been stabbed 25 times. The crime scene suggested she had fought desperately for her life. There were signs of a fierce struggle, but there were no signs of forced entry, no indication that the house had been ransacked or that robbery had been the motive. This was violence for violence's sake, an attack of stunning brutality that ended in Linda's death on her own living room floor. What made Linda Moore's murder particularly significant to investigators was the location and manner of the crime. Unlike the other victims, Linda hadn't been abducted and taken somewhere remote. She had been killed in her own home, in the middle of the afternoon, in a crime that seemed to have been carried out with shocking efficiency. This suggested either a departure from the killer's usual method or perhaps an indication of how comfortable they had become, how confident in their ability to strike and escape without being caught. It also suggested a level of boldness that was deeply troubling. Attacking someone in their home required crossing a threshold, both literally and psychologically, that most criminals avoid. Multiple witnesses came forward after Linda's murder. They reported having seen a man near her home on the day she was killed. The descriptions were consistent. A stocky man in his early to mid-20s, with dark hair, clean-shaven, wearing dark-rimmed glasses and carrying a blue knapsack. He had a round face and had been seen lingering in the area around the time of the murder. This was the first real composite description law enforcement had of a potential suspect. A sketch was created and released to the public. People studied it, trying to see if they recognized the face, trying to match it to anyone they knew. But the man in the sketch was never definitively identified, and later investigations would suggest that this individual was questioned and excluded from the suspect list. He had been near Linda's home, but he apparently hadn't been her killer. For days after Linda Moore's murder, Bernice Courtmanche's remains were identified, the young woman who had disappeared nearly 2 years earlier. Then, in January of 1987, another woman went missing. Barbara Agnew was 38 years old and lived in Norwich, Vermont. On January 10th, she was returning home from a ski trip on Stratton Mountain with friends. She was last seen heading toward Norwich, driving her green BMW. Later that evening, A snowplow driver found her car parked at a rest stop near Interstate 91 in Hartford, Vermont. The driver's side door was slightly open. There was blood on the steering wheel and in the back seat. But Barbara herself was gone. The discovery of Barbara's abandoned car sent a chill through the investigation. The blood suggested violence had occurred in or near the vehicle. The location, a rest stop along a major interstate, was different from where other victims had disappeared, but it shared the same characteristic of being a place where someone might stop alone, where they might be vulnerable. Barbara's body was found 2 months later, in March of 1987, by hikers who stumbled upon her remains in a wooded area in Heartland, Vermont. An autopsy determined she had been stabbed to death. The location where her body was found was approximately 12 miles from where her car had been discovered. 7 women now murdered over the span of nearly a decade. Kathy Milliken in 1978, Mary Critchley in 1981, Bernice Courtemanche in 1984, Ellen Fried in 1984, Eva Morse, date of death uncertain but body found in 1986, Linda Moore in 1986, Barbara Agnew in 1987. The Connecticut River Valley Killer, as the media had begun calling this unknown perpetrator, had claimed victim after victim, and despite the efforts of law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions, despite the fear and vigilance of the community, despite all the resources being poured into the investigation, the killer remained unidentified and at large. The psychological toll on the community was immense. Women who lived alone installed better locks, bought dogs, changed their routines. Parents restricted their daughters' movements in ways that would have seemed unnecessary just a few years earlier. The simple act of stopping at a convenience store after dark, of driving alone on a rural road, of being outside when the sun went down, all of these ordinary activities now carried a weight of risk that they hadn't before. People were living in fear, and that fear was entirely justified because the person responsible for these murders was still out there, still moving through their world. Investigators were working with several theories. The most prominent was that the killer was someone who lived in or had deep ties to the Connecticut River Valley area. The choice of dump sites, the knowledge of back roads and secluded locations, all pointed to someone with local familiarity. There was also evidence that several of the victims might have been nurses or worked in healthcare, which led to speculation that the killer might have some connection to that field, either through work or personal relationships. But these were just theories, educated guesses based on patterns that might or might not be meaningful. What was becoming clear, though, was that the killer was organized, methodical, and capable of controlling their impulses enough to avoid capture. The gaps between some of the murders, years in some cases, suggested someone who could disappear back into normal life, who didn't necessarily kill in a frenzy of uncontrolled rage, but rather as part of a pattern that they could start and stop. This made them all the more dangerous because it meant they could be anyone, a neighbor, a coworker, someone who seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface while carrying the capacity for horrific violence beneath. By the summer of 1988, the Connecticut River Valley had lived under the shadow of these unsolved murders for nearly a decade. 7 women were dead. The investigation had generated thousands of tips, hundreds of interviews, and numerous potential suspects, but no arrests. The case files were thick with information that led nowhere. Families grieved without closure. Communities remained on edge. And then, on August 6, 1988, something happened that would change the trajectory of the case in a fundamental way. The killer made a mistake. They left a survivor. Jane Borowski was 22 years old that summer, and she was 7 months pregnant. The night of August 6th was hot and humid. The kind of muggy New England evening where the air feels thick and the desire for something cold and refreshing becomes almost overwhelming. Jane had spent the evening at the Cheshire County Fair in Swansea, New Hampshire, enjoying the simple pleasures of fair food and time with friends. As she drove home, around midnight, she decided to stop at Gamarlo's Supermarket on Route 110 in West Swansea to get a soda from the vending machine. The store was closed at that hour, but the vending machines were still accessible in the parking lot. Jane pulled in, parked, and walked over to get her drink. The area was quiet, isolated in the way that rural New Hampshire can be late at night. Few cars passed by. The parking lot lights cast pools of illumination surrounded by darkness. Jane got her soda and returned to her car, settling into the driver's seat, preparing to continue her drive home. That's when another vehicle pulled into the parking lot and parked right next to her, on her passenger side. At first, Jane didn't think much of it. Someone else wanting a snack or a drink from the vending machines, perhaps. But then a man got out of his vehicle and walked around to her driver's side window. He asked if the payphone worked. It was a reasonable question, an innocuous opening. Jane probably didn't feel threatened in that initial moment. Then the man opened her car door and tried to pull her out of the vehicle. The attack had begun. Jane fought back. She was fighting not just for her own life, but for the life of her unborn child. She kicked and struggled with such force that she shattered her own windshield. The man made accusations at her, strange, seemingly random statements that didn't make logical sense. He was escalating, becoming more aggressive. At one point, he pulled out a knife and said something to the effect of, "Maybe this will persuade you to get out of the vehicle." Faced with the knife, Jane complied. She got out of the car. For a moment, according to Jane's later recollections, the situation seemed to de-escalate. She thought he might leave. She even had the presence of mind to be concerned about her shattered windshield and to voice that concern. Those would be words she'd regret for the rest of her life because they prompted him to pull out the knife again. What happened next occurred with horrifying speed. Jane saw headlights approaching on the rural road and ran toward them, screaming for help. The man tackled her. He knocked her to the ground and pinned her on her back. Then he began stabbing her. He stabbed Jane 27 times. The wounds were to her abdomen, her back, her arms, her chest. He severed her jugular vein. He collapsed both her lungs. He lacerated her kidney. He cut tendons in her knees and thumb. The attack was savage, sustained, meant to kill. When he was done, he got up, walked back to his vehicle, and drove away, leaving Jane bleeding in the parking lot of a closed convenience store in the middle of the night. He left her for dead. But Jane was not dead. Somehow, despite her injuries, despite the fact that she should not have been able to move, let alone drive, Jane managed to get back into her car. She drove toward a friend's house. Along the way, she noticed headlights behind her. With growing horror, she realized it was his vehicle. He was following her. Jane drove faster, despite her weakening condition, despite the blood loss, despite the pain. She reached her friend's house, and the people inside immediately came to her aid. As they did, the attacker's vehicle, which Jane later described as a brown Jeep Wagoneer with wood grain trim, performed a U-turn and slowly passed by the house before speeding away into the night. Emergency responders rushed Jane to a local hospital. The medical team worked to stabilize her, to stop the bleeding, to address the extensive damage her attacker had inflicted. It was touch and go. The baby, still 7 months from term, was in distress. But both Jane and her daughter survived. The baby would later be diagnosed with mild cerebral palsy, a lasting effect of the trauma her mother had endured, but she lived. They both lived. And for the first time in this series of attacks, law enforcement had a witness. They had someone who had seen the killer's face, who had heard his voice, who could describe his vehicle. Jane was able to provide a detailed description to investigators. She described a white male, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing between 150 and 160 pounds, with blonde hair, clean-shaven, somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. She remembered the Jeep Wagoneer, brown with wood grain paneling, a model year likely between 1975 and 1984. She had even caught the first 3 characters of his license plate, though not all of them, a detail that investigators hoped might help narrow the search. A composite sketch was created based on Jane's description and distributed to the public. The investigation intensified. Detectives came to Jane's hospital room almost daily, asking questions, reviewing details, trying to find the thread that would lead them to the man who had attacked her. Jane, despite her physical and emotional trauma, cooperated fully. She believed, as did the investigators, that with the car description and the partial license plate and the composite sketch, they would find him. It seemed impossible that someone who had left such clear evidence, who had been seen and survived being seen, would escape justice. Days passed, then weeks. Tips came in. People called to report brown Jeep Wagoneers they'd seen. Potential suspects were investigated and cleared, but the man who had attacked Jane Borowski was not found. What did become clear, though, was that Jane's attack likely marked the end of the Connecticut River Valley Killer's murder spree. After August of 1988, there were no more disappearances that fit the pattern. No more bodies found with the characteristic stab wounds in the characteristic locations. It was as if Jane's survival had somehow disrupted whatever cycle the killer had been following. Perhaps having a witness, having someone who could describe him, identify his vehicle, provide details to law enforcement, was enough to make him stop. Or perhaps he died, moved away, was incarcerated for some other crime. No one knows for certain. What is certain is that the attacks stopped, and they stopped after Jane fought for her life and won. The years that followed Jane Borowski's attack were marked by a strange kind of suspended animation. The murders had stopped, but the case remained unsolved. Families of the victims continued to grieve without resolution. The communities along the Connecticut River Valley slowly began to relax their vigilance, but the memory of those dark years never fully faded. And Jane herself had to navigate life as a survivor, carrying both the physical scars of her attack and the knowledge that the man who tried to kill her had never been caught. For 20 years after her attack, Jane didn't receive counseling for what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She had nightmares where she was being chased, where she relived the attack, where she saw the faces of the 7 women who had been murdered. She dealt with depression, with anger, with the fear that he might come back for her. She lived with the question of whether he had followed her to that convenience store or whether she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another opportunity for someone who was always looking for opportunities. These questions, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, haunted her. In 2006, nearly 18 years after her attack, a private investigator named Lynn Marie Carty brought a new name into the conversation around the Connecticut River Valley murders. She proposed that Michael Niccolo, a decorated Vietnam War veteran with a history of violence, might be the killer. Niccolo had murdered his estranged wife and stepdaughter on New Year's Eve 2005 before taking his own life. In the investigation that followed his death, details emerged about his history, his whereabouts in the 1980s, and his patterns of behavior that seemed, to some, to align with the profile of the Connecticut River Valley Killer. Niccolo had lived in the Connecticut River Valley area during much of the 1980s. He had a history of violence against women. He had been in the military and was known to have knife skills. Private investigator Carty did extensive research, creating timelines that placed Niccolo in the region during many of the murders. She showed Jane photographs of Niccolo. Initially, Jane identified him as possibly being her attacker. For a while, it seemed like the case might finally be moving toward resolution. News coverage of Niccolo as a suspect was extensive. Jane came forward publicly, stating her belief that he was the man who had attacked her. Families of victims allowed themselves to hope that they might finally have answers. But as time went on and more investigation was done, the Niccolo theory began to fall apart. There were inconsistencies. Jane's attacker had used a knife, and she had survived to describe the attack in detail. But Niccolo's known pattern of violence involved guns, not knives. He had shot his wife and stepdaughter. He had been implicated in other crimes that involved firearms. The shift from knives to a gun didn't fit the typical pattern of serial offenders, who usually stick to a preferred method. Additionally, there was no direct physical evidence linking Niccolo to any of the Connecticut River Valley murders. No DNA matches, no witnesses who could place him at any of the crime scenes. Nothing concrete that moved beyond coincidence and circumstantial possibility. By 2022, Jane publicly stated that she no longer believed Michael Niccolo was her attacker. The initial certainty she'd felt when shown his photograph had been replaced by doubt and then by conviction that he wasn't the right person. She acknowledged that he was a bad man, someone capable of terrible things, but she didn't believe he was the Connecticut River Valley Killer. This reversal was painful for Jane and likely for the families of victims who had briefly believed they might get closure. But it was also honest, a recognition that wanting someone to be guilty doesn't make them guilty, and that the truth, however elusive, matters more than convenient answers. Other suspects have emerged over the years, mentioned in various investigations and true crime programs. A man named Rodney Stanger was considered at one point. There was an unnamed individual whose son came forward, suspecting his father might have been involved. In 2024, there was a search of a property in Newport, New Hampshire, connected to someone who had been considered a suspect in the case for some time. As of the creation of this recording, no arrests have been made. The search warrants related to these investigations are sealed. The public doesn't know what, if anything, was found. What we do know is that advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA analysis, have given investigators tools that didn't exist in the 1980s. DNA evidence from the crime scenes has been preserved. As technology improves, as databases expand, there remains the possibility that a match might be found. In 2018, it was reported that DNA testing in the Connecticut River Valley cases had been delayed due to the backlog at the forensic lab, with other homicidal cases taking priority. This kind of delay is frustrating for families and for the public, but it's a reality of how these investigations work, especially in states like New Hampshire where resources are limited and the volume of unsolved cases is substantial. The Connecticut River Valley killer case is now handled by the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit, part of the Attorney General's office. They continue to investigate, applying new forensic techniques to old evidence, following up on tips that still come in, coordinating with other law enforcement agencies. The case has been profiled on numerous true crime programs, podcasts, and in books. Each new examination brings fresh attention, sometimes generating new leads. But as of now, the identity of the person who murdered 7 women and attacked an 8th remains unknown. For Jane Borowski, the journey since her attack has been one of transformation. She spent years dealing with trauma, but she has also become an advocate for victims and survivors. She co-hosts a podcast called Invisible Tears, where she shares her story and amplifies other unsolved cases. She speaks publicly about what happened to her, not in pursuit of celebrity or attention, but because she believes that keeping these cases in the public eye is important. She believes that someone out there knows something, that the person who attacked her might have confided in someone, might have left evidence that hasn't been recognized yet. And she believes that the families of the 7 women who were murdered deserve answers. There's something profound about Jane's willingness to continue engaging with her trauma, to use it as a means of helping others, to refuse to let the attack define her in terms of victimhood. She often says that she and her daughter are survivors, that this is something her attacker couldn't take away from her. She carries her scars as a badge of honor now, a testament to her fight, to her refusal to give up. Her daughter, who was in the womb during the attack and who survived against all odds, is now an adult with a family of her own. Jane is a grandmother. Life has moved forward, even as the shadow of that night in August 1988 remains. The families of the 7 murdered women have similarly had to find ways to move forward without closure. Kathy Milliken's family has never stopped hoping that her case will be solved. They released a statement during a recent search connected to her murder, expressing their continued pain and their enduring hope. The families of Mary Critchley, Bernice Courtmanche, Ellen Fried, Eva Morse, Linda Moore, and Barbara Agnew have all had to live with the knowledge that the person who took their loved ones was never held accountable. Some have participated in advocacy efforts, joining with Jane and others to demand better resources for cold case investigations. Some have chosen to grieve more privately, but all carry the weight of unanswered questions. The Connecticut River Valley community itself has changed in the decades since these murders. The area is no longer quite as rural or isolated as it was in the 1980s. Technology has advanced. Security cameras are common. Cell phones mean people are rarely truly out of contact. The kind of anonymity that might have allowed a serial killer to operate with relative impunity in the past would be harder to maintain today. But the memory of those years, of the fear and the losses and the sense that their small, safe world had been violated, that memory persists. People still talk about the Connecticut River Valley killer. Parents still tell their children to be careful, to be aware, to never assume they're completely safe. There are those who believe the killer is dead. The cessation of the murders after Jane's attack, combined with the nearly 4 decades that have passed without any similar pattern emerging, suggests to some that whoever was responsible either died, was incarcerated for another crime, or left the area permanently. Others believe the person is still alive, still living in the region perhaps, carrying the secret of what they did. Without an arrest or a confession, without definitive proof one way or another, we simply don't know. What we can say with certainty is that this case represents one of New England's most significant unsolved serial murder investigations. 7 confirmed victims over a span of 10 years. One survivor who fought back and lived to tell her story. A pattern of violence that was both organized and opportunistic, methodical yet brutal. And a complete absence of justice for the lives taken and the families left behind. The Connecticut River Valley killer case stands as a reminder that even in places that feel safe, even in communities that pride themselves on knowing their neighbors, terrible things can happen. And sometimes, despite the best efforts of investigators and the courage of survivors and the demands of grieving families, those terrible things remain mysteries. As this story draws to a close, as you drift towards sleep with these details settling in your mind, it's worth remembering the names of those who were lost. Kathy Milliken, who went out to photograph birds on a beautiful autumn day. Mary Critchley, a student on her way to Vermont. Bernice Courtmanche, a 17-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. Ellen Fried, a nurse who called her sister from a payphone late at night. Eva Morse, whose remains were found in the same woods as Ellen's. Linda Moore, attacked in her own home on a Tuesday afternoon. Barbara Agnew, returning from a ski trip with friends. And Jane Borowski, who survived to tell this story, to keep these women's memories alive, to continue asking the questions that still have no answers. The Connecticut River Valley remains beautiful. The river still flows through forests and farmland. The small towns along its banks continue their rhythms of daily life. But there's a layer of history there now, a dark chapter that can't be forgotten or erased. And somewhere in that history is a truth that remains hidden, a name that has never been spoken in connection with these crimes, a person who knows exactly what happened on those nights and days when 7 women lost their lives. Until that truth comes to light, if it ever does, this case will continue to haunt the valley and all those touched by it. Rest well, knowing that even unsolved, these stories matter. The lives lost matter. The survivors' courage matters. And the search for truth, however long it takes, however much it costs, continues. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Quiet Disappearance. The Brian Egg Case. There's a narrow alley in San Francisco, tucked between the noise of the city, where palm trees sway and old Victorian houses line a cobblestone street. For decades, the same man walked that alley every single day with his dog, watering plants that didn't belong to him, greeting neighbors he'd known for 40 years, and then one spring he simply stopped. The neighbors noticed immediately. They called the police. They asked questions. They grew worried. But by the time anyone took them seriously, it had already been too late for weeks. Tonight, I want to tell you about Brian Egg, a 65-year-old bartender who lived on the margins of San Francisco society but somehow became the heart of his neighborhood. This is a story about what happens when warnings go unheeded, when something terrible unfolds in plain sight, and when the people who care most are left to wonder if they could have done something different. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me walk you through a case that, even now, remains unresolved. Let me start by painting you a picture of the place where this all happened. Clara Street isn't really a street at all. It's more of an alley, a narrow lane tucked into San Francisco's south of Market neighborhood. The locals call it Soma. By 2018, Soma had become one of those neighborhoods caught between two worlds. On one side, you had the old San Francisco, the artists and the eccentric characters who'd lived there since the 70s. On the other side, tech money was flooding in, driving up real estate prices, replacing warehouses with luxury condos. But Clara Street held on to something of its old character. The houses there were modest, packed close together. You could stand in your kitchen and hear your neighbor's television. Everyone knew everyone. And in that tight-knit community, Brian Egg was something of a fixture. Brian had lived at 228 Clara Street since 1976. He'd bought the place for $19,000 back then, a sum that seems almost quaint now. By 2018, that same property would be valued at over $1.5 million. But Brian never seemed interested in cashing out or moving on. Clara Street was home. People who knew Brian described him in terms that painted a particular kind of portrait. He was eccentric, they'd say, a curmudgeon at times. He lived modestly on the fringes of society, without steady employment in his later years. In the 1980s, he'd worked as a bartender at the Stud, a legendary gay bar in San Francisco that was known as much for its welcoming atmosphere as for its colorful history. But by the time Brian was in his 60s, those days were long behind him. What hadn't changed was his routine. Every single day, Brian would walk his dog, a scruffy little companion named Lucky. He'd make his way down Clara Street, stopping to water plants that grew outside his neighbors' homes. He'd chat with the people he passed. He painted sometimes, creating small pieces of art that he'd give away as gifts. Friends remembered him handing out cashmere coats he'd found at thrift stores, planting palm trees in the neighborhood just because he thought they'd look nice. There was a generosity to Brian that people remembered, a warmth. He was the kind of person who noticed when someone needed something and quietly helped without making a fuss about it. One neighbor recalled how Brian once gave them small paintings he thought they'd enjoy. Another remembered him as always being there, always saying hello, always part of the daily rhythm of the street. But Brian also had another side. He was private in certain ways. His home, a two-story building with both an upstairs living space and a downstairs unit, was something of a mystery to most neighbors. Some knew he occasionally let people stay in the downstairs space, usually young men who were experiencing homelessness, people who needed a place to sleep for a night or two. It was an act of kindness, but it also meant that strangers sometimes passed through Brian's life in ways his neighbors didn't always track. The house itself had an unusual layout. There were rooms that weren't immediately obvious, spaces tucked away behind doors or under stairs. Nothing sinister about that on its own. Old San Francisco houses often have odd configurations, the result of decades of additions and modifications. But it meant that Brian's home held spaces most people had never seen. And then there was Brian's brother, Devin, who lived across the country in Florida. Devin and Brian weren't estranged, but they weren't particularly close either. They'd check in with each other every so often, the way siblings do when life has taken them in different directions. Devin knew his brother lived simply, that money was often tight, that Brian's world was small and centered on Clara Street. In late May of 2018, that world began to shift in ways no one quite understood at first. It started with absence. Brian's daily walks stopped. Lucky, the dog, was no longer seen trotting along the cobblestones. The plants outside neighbors' homes went unwatered. For people who'd lived on Clara Street for years, who'd seen Brian nearly every day, this was immediately strange. Brian was a creature of habit. He didn't travel. He didn't take vacations. His life was predictable in a way that made sudden change feel wrong. One of the first people to notice was Scott Free, a neighbor and friend who'd known Brian for nearly 20 years. Scott had even rented a unit in Brian's building briefly, back in the early 2000s. He knew Brian well enough to sense when something was off. And by early June, something was definitely off. When Scott walked past Brian's house, he started noticing things that didn't fit. There were people coming and going who he didn't recognize. Young men, strangers who seemed to be living in the house. When Scott knocked on the door to ask about Brian, these men would answer. They'd offer vague explanations. Brian was on vacation, they'd say. He'd be back soon. But Scott knew that made no sense. Brian didn't vacation. He didn't have the money for it, and more importantly, he didn't have the inclination. His life was Clara Street. The idea of him suddenly deciding to travel somewhere was implausible. Other neighbors started noticing the same things. There were more strangers, people who looked like they might be homeless, entering and exiting the property. The sense of unease on Clara Street began to grow. These were people who knew each other, who looked out for one another. And now one of their own had vanished, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. So they did what concerned neighbors do. They called the police. The first welfare check happened sometime in June. San Francisco police officers knocked on the door of 228 Clara Street, asked if everything was okay. The men inside told them Brian was away. Everything was fine. The officers, finding no immediate signs of trouble, no probable cause to enter the home, left. The neighbors weren't satisfied. They called again. Police returned, knocked on the door, got the same story. Brian was on vacation. Everything was fine. And again, the officers left. But on Clara Street, people weren't buying it. The wrongness of the situation intensified. The strangers kept coming and going. Brian's absence stretched from days into weeks. And then Devin Egg, calling from Florida to check on his brother, encountered something that sent a chill through him. When Devin dialed Brian's home number in late June or early July, an answering machine picked up. That alone was strange. Brian didn't use answering machines. He wasn't a technology person. But even stranger was the voice on the recording. It wasn't Brian's voice. It was someone else, asking callers to leave a message. Devin hung up, confused. He called back. This time, a man answered. He said his name was Nate. He told Devin that Brian was out walking his dog and would call right back. Brian never called back. Devin tried again later. The answering machine now had a different message. This one said Brian was on vacation. Devin didn't recognize that voice either. And the more he thought about it, the more wrong it all felt. His brother didn't go on vacations. His brother didn't have an answering machine. And his brother certainly wouldn't disappear without telling anyone. Back on Clara Street, the neighbors' concerns were reaching a breaking point. People were talking to each other, comparing notes, realizing they all had the same unsettled feeling. Something had happened to Brian. They were sure of it now, but the police kept coming, kept knocking, kept leaving without going inside. The legal reality was frustrating but clear. Without probable cause, without any immediate evidence of danger or criminal activity, police couldn't simply force their way into someone's home. The men inside were offering explanations, however thin they sounded. And from the outside, from the street, there was no visible sign that anything criminal had occurred. But then, in early August, something changed. Neighbors noticed a man at Brian's house who was frantically cleaning, not just tidying up. He was scrubbing floors with such intensity that soapy water was pouring out under the door and into the street. The smell of bleach was overwhelming, sharp and chemical, filling the alley. People watched from their windows, alarmed. This wasn't normal cleaning. This was something else. The next day, someone spotted a different kind of vehicle outside 228 Clara Street. It was a large white truck with lettering on the side, a biohazard cleanup vehicle. The company was called Aftermath Services. They specialized in crime scene cleanup. That was when the neighbors knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had happened. They called 911 immediately. This time, when police arrived, they didn't just knock on the door. They entered the home. And what they found inside would turn a worried neighborhood's suspicions into one of San Francisco's most disturbing unsolved homicides. August 14th, 2018. That's the date everything became official. The moment when suspicion turned into confirmed tragedy. When San Francisco police officers entered Brian Egg's home that afternoon, they were met immediately by a man who identified himself as Robert McCaffrey. He was 52 years old, and neighbors would later say they'd seen him around the property in recent weeks. McCaffrey told officers that he'd been hired to meet the cleanup crew. He had cash in hand, reportedly around $1,000, ready to pay for their services. The officers moved through the house slowly. There was a smell in the air, something the crime scene cleanup crew had likely been hired to address. It was the kind of smell that, once you've encountered it, you never forget. The sweet, heavy odor of decomposition. The house had that odd layout I mentioned earlier. Rooms tucked behind other rooms, spaces that weren't immediately visible. The cleanup crew and police moved carefully, documenting everything, looking for the source of the smell, and eventually they found it. Under a staircase, concealed in a way that wasn't immediately obvious, there was a large fish tank. It measured 18 inches wide, 28 inches high, and 72 inches long. About 6 feet of container, filled with liquid to a depth of 24 inches. And inside that liquid, weighted down by a sawhorse and other objects, was a human torso. The remains were in advanced decomposition. The head was missing. Both hands were missing. The legs had been severed, but the feet were still present, still inside socks, discovered with the rest of the remains in the fish tank. The liquid surrounding the body was caustic chemical. Empty bottles of Drano were found nearby, suggesting someone had used the drain cleaner as part of an attempt to destroy or conceal the evidence. The scene was methodical. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion where someone panicked and tried to cover up their actions in a hurry. This was deliberate. Someone had taken the time to dismember a body, to place it in a container designed to accelerate decomposition, to use chemicals that would break down tissue and bone. The sawhorse pressing down on the remains suggested they'd thought about buoyancy, about making sure the body stayed submerged. Police immediately launched a homicide investigation. But there was a significant problem. Without a head, without hands, without any obvious identifying features on what remained, they couldn't confirm who the victim was. They strongly suspected it was Brian Egg. The body was found in his home. He'd been missing for months. But suspicion isn't the same as certainty, and in a criminal case, certainty matters. DNA analysis would take time. Weeks, potentially months. They'd need to collect samples from Brian's relatives, compare them to tissue recovered from the fish tank, confirm identity through scientific means. Until then, they couldn't officially say the victim was Brian Egg. While the identification process began, police focused on the people who'd been in and around the house. Robert McCaffrey was arrested immediately at the scene. But there was someone else police were interested in, someone neighbors had mentioned repeatedly in their calls over the summer. His name was Lance Silva. Lance Silva was 39 years old in 2018. He had a criminal history. In 2015, he'd been convicted of grand theft after embezzling money from the retirement accounts of employees at an upholstery company he'd once owned in Emeryville, a city across the bay from San Francisco. He'd served time for that crime and was on parole when he crossed paths with Brian Egg. The exact nature of Silva's relationship with Brian wasn't entirely clear. What was clear, based on financial records police would later obtain, was that Lance Silva had been using Brian Egg's debit card. On June 1st, 2018, just days after Brian was last seen, someone claiming to be Brian Egg walked into a car dealership in Newark, California. This person purchased a 2007 BMW for $5,500. They used Brian Egg's debit card for the transaction. They provided documentation in Brian's name. But it wasn't Brian making that purchase. When police eventually tracked down the paperwork for that car sale, they found it in Lance Silva's possession. This single transaction told investigators something crucial. By June 1st, just days after Brian had disappeared from his daily routine, someone was already using his identity, accessing his money, pretending to be him, and that someone appeared to be Lance Silva. The car purchased that day was later towed on June 15th from a location on 5th Street in San Francisco, not far from Clara Street, for parking in a no-stopping zone. It was another small detail, another piece of evidence suggesting that Silva had been in the area, using Brian's resources, during the time Brian was missing. Police arrested Lance Silva on August 17th, 3 days after finding the remains in Brian's home. He was taken from a nearby residential hotel and booked on suspicion of multiple charges: homicide, identity theft, elder abuse, and financial crimes. Robert McCaffrey was also charged, though his alleged role seemed less central. According to police, McCaffrey had been the one to meet the crime scene cleanup crew, to facilitate the attempt to erase evidence of what had happened in that house. Both men were held in custody. To the neighbors on Clara Street, to Devin Egg calling from Florida, to everyone who'd been worried about Brian for months, it seemed like the case was moving forward. Police had suspects in custody. Charges had been filed. Maybe there would finally be answers. But then something unexpected happened. The San Francisco District Attorney's Office declined to file formal charges. Their reasoning, as they explained publicly, was that they needed more evidence before moving forward with a prosecution. The investigation wasn't complete. The body still hadn't been officially identified. The medical examiner hadn't yet issued a final cause of death report. Without these crucial pieces of information, the DA's office felt they couldn't proceed to trial. Robert McCaffrey was released from custody within days of his arrest. Lance Silva, however, remained in jail, not because of Brian Egg's case, but because he'd violated the terms of his parole from his earlier grand theft conviction. Alameda County, which had jurisdiction over his parole, held him at Santa Rita Jail in Dublin on that violation. So even though the murder charges were dropped, Silva stayed behind bars. To the people who'd known Brian, this development was infuriating. They'd called police repeatedly over the summer. They'd expressed concerns. They'd watched strangers take over their neighbor's home. And now, even with a body found in a fish tank, even with financial crimes clearly committed using Brian's identity, no one was being charged with murder. San Francisco police defended their handling of the welfare checks. Commander Greg McEachern held a press conference in August and explained that officers had gone to the house 3 times, but without probable cause to enter, without any visible emergency, they couldn't violate someone's privacy rights. The men who answered the door had been polite, had offered explanations, and there was no legal basis to force entry. Neighbors strongly disputed this characterization. They felt their concerns had been dismissed, that more aggressive investigation earlier might have changed things. But the police maintained that they'd followed proper procedure. The medical examiner's office continued working to identify the remains. Relatives provided DNA samples. The process moved slowly. And while it moved, Lance Silva sat in jail on his parole violation, and Robert McCaffrey walked free, and on Clara Street, people waited for someone to tell them what had happened to Brian. September 11th, 2018 would have been Brian's 66th birthday. That evening, neighbors, friends, and family gathered outside 228 Clara Street for a candlelight vigil. People brought old photographs of Brian from the 70s, when he was young and smiling. They brought paintings he'd made. They brought stories. One man, Mark Rosenheimer, arrived with a folder of black and white photos. He was 81 years old, and he'd dated Brian back in the 70s. They'd met at a club in North Beach, had lived together briefly in the Clara Street house. Rosenheimer hadn't seen Brian in over a decade, but when he heard the news, he felt compelled to come, to remember, to honor the man he'd known all those years ago. Nearly everyone at the vigil had a story about Brian's generosity. The cashmere coats, the small gifts of art, the palm trees he'd planted in the neighborhood. One neighbor recalled how Brian had been arrested once for growing cannabis, back when that could get you in serious trouble, and how he'd laughed about it afterward. Another remembered dancing with him at gay clubs when they were young. Brian's sister, Lynn Egjakasovas, spoke on behalf of the family. She described the confusion and sadness they felt, not knowing for certain what had happened, waiting for official confirmation. Because even then, on what should have been his birthday, they still didn't have absolute certainty that the body in the fish tank was Brian Egg. That confirmation would come eventually. In late September, after weeks of DNA analysis, the medical examiner's office released their finding. The remains found at 228 Clara Street were definitively identified as Brian Egg. But identifying the victim was only part of the puzzle. The bigger question remained: what exactly had killed him? By May of 2019, nearly a year after Brian's disappearance, the medical examiner's office released their autopsy report. It was a document that raised as many questions as it answered. Dr. Amy Hart, the assistant medical examiner, determined that Brian Egg's cause of death was unspecified homicidal violence with blunt force trauma. Let me break down what that means and what it doesn't mean. The examination of Brian's remains was complicated by their condition. The body had been immersed in drano for an extended period, which had caused significant deterioration. When the medical examiner described the bones during the examination, they used the word furry to characterize their appearance, a term that suggests advanced chemical degradation. Much of the tissue had already broken down by the time the remains were discovered. As they manipulated the body to remove it from the fish tank, biological material was literally falling off the bones. This made determining precise cause of death extremely difficult. But there were findings that told a story. 2 of Brian's ribs showed fresh fractures. 1 of his vertebrae also had a break. These injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma to the chest, the kind that comes from being struck with significant force. The breaks showed characteristics that suggested they'd occurred around the time of death, not afterward. These fractures became the foundation for the homicide determination. Someone had struck Brian hard enough to break bones in his chest and spine. Those injuries, Dr. Hart concluded, indicated homicidal violence. However, and this is important, the report couldn't specify exactly how Brian died. The deterioration of the body made it impossible to say whether the blunt force trauma itself was lethal or whether Brian died by another means. Could he have been suffocated? Strangled? The soft tissue damage that would show those causes was no longer present to examine. Dr. Judy Melinek, a Bay Area forensic pathologist who reviewed the report but wasn't directly involved in the case, offered her perspective to journalists. She explained that the manner of death determination in this case relied heavily on the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the body, rather than purely on autopsy findings. The fact that the body had been dismembered, concealed in a fish tank, and dissolved in chemicals all pointed toward homicide, regardless of what the bones alone could prove. This raised a challenge for prosecutors. Proving murder in court typically requires establishing cause of death beyond reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys could potentially argue that Brian died of natural causes or an overdose, and that someone panicked and tried to dispose of the body afterward. Disposing of a body is a crime, certainly, but it's not necessarily murder. The ambiguity in the autopsy report was one reason the district attorney's office had been reluctant to file charges earlier. They wanted solid medical evidence before going to trial. But there were other pieces of evidence that painted a clearer picture of what had happened in the weeks and months after Brian's disappearance. The financial crimes were straightforward. Lance Silva had used Brian's debit card to purchase a car, value $5,500, on June 1st. That transaction alone proved identity theft and financial fraud. But it also suggested something more sinister. By June 1st, Silva was confident enough to walk into a dealership and impersonate Brian without fear of being contradicted or caught. That confidence implied he knew Brian wouldn't be appearing to dispute the purchase. Then there was the matter of the answering machine and the phone calls. When Devin Egg called his brother in late June or early July, someone had installed an answering machine on Brian's home phone line. Brian had never owned or used an answering machine. The voice on the recording wasn't Brian's. Later, that message would change to say Brian was on vacation. Who installed that machine? Who recorded those messages? The implication was clear. Someone was actively managing Brian's communications, creating a false narrative of his whereabouts, preventing people from discovering his death. The man who answered the phone and identified himself as Nate told Devin that Brian was out walking his dog and would call right back. But Brian never called. Because, as investigators would come to believe, Brian was likely already dead by that point, possibly for weeks. The timeline suggested by the evidence indicated that Brian had probably died sometime in late May or very early June of 2018. The horse incident that neighbor Wilma Parker remembered, which occurred in mid-May, became relevant in retrospect. She recalled police horses being on Clara Street for a historical commemoration, and one horse becoming agitated outside Brian's door, rearing up as if spooked by something. Parker believed that even then, Brian might have already been dead inside his home. The various welfare checks by police occurred throughout June and July. Each time, officers knocked, were told Brian was away, and left. Meanwhile, Lance Silva and possibly Robert McCaffrey were living in the house, using Brian's resources, managing his property as if it were their own. The frantic cleaning that neighbors witnessed in early August, the soapy water and bleach smell, likely occurred because the men inside the house knew police interest was intensifying. They needed to clean up evidence before investigators gained access. But why call a professional crime scene cleanup company? That's what investigators wanted to know. These companies are expensive. They're also discreet and thorough. Someone who hires aftermath services isn't just trying to tidy up. They're trying to eliminate forensic evidence. They're trying to erase signs of violence. According to police, Lance Silva used Brian Egg's debit card to pay for that cleanup crew. It was another financial crime, another use of Brian's identity. But it was also an admission, in a way, that there was something in that house that needed professional-grade cleaning. The neighbors who spotted the aftermath services truck and called 911 had, quite literally, saved the case. If that cleanup had been completed before police entered the property, who knows what evidence might have been lost. By April of 2019, Lance Silva had served his time on the parole violation and was released from Santa Rita jail. The official reason for his release was listed as sentence served. To Brian's family and friends, this was devastating. Devin Egg told journalists he was angry that he'd received no notification that Silva was being released. The man who'd been living in his brother's house, who'd used his brother's debit card, who'd been arrested on suspicion of his brother's murder, was now free. Scot-free, the neighbor who'd first raised concerns, told reporters it appeared that Silva had gotten away with murder. San Francisco police issued statements saying the investigation remained ongoing, that they were following good leads, that they were confident they'd make an arrest. But months passed, and no arrest came. The district attorney's office maintained that they couldn't file charges until police presented them with a complete case. Police maintained that they were still investigating, still building evidence. Each agency pointed to the other, and in the middle of this bureaucratic impasse sat an unsolved homicide. By August of 2019, a full year after the discovery of Brian's remains, friends and neighbors held another gathering. The frustration was palpable. How could this case remain unsolved? How could no one be in custody? Brian's home on Clara Street was sold in 2019. The asking price was just over $1.5 million, a staggering increase from the $19,000 Brian had paid in 1976. The buyer was a developer who planned to demolish the property and build a multi-unit condominium complex. For the people who'd known Brian, there was something deeply unsettling about this. The place where he'd lived for over 40 years, where he'd built a life, where he'd been killed and concealed for months, was about to be erased entirely. A new building, new residents, no memory of what had happened there. Brian's dog, Lucky, had been adopted by someone new after his death. A neighbor reported spotting Lucky in Union Square with his new owner months later, and the dog seemed happy, seemed to be doing well. It was a small mercy in an otherwise bleak story. Here's where we are now, years after Brian Egg's death, and the case remains officially unsolved. No one has been charged with his murder. Lance Silva and Robert McCaffrey, the two men arrested in August of 2018, have never faced prosecution for Brian's death. Silva completed his parole violation sentence and was released. McCaffrey was released within days of his arrest and has largely disappeared from public record. Neither man has spoken publicly about what they know. When journalists tried to reach them, efforts were unsuccessful. When the Bay Area reporter spoke briefly with Silva while he was in jail on the parole violation, he would only say he wanted to talk to his lawyer. Brian's head and hands have never been recovered. This remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Someone went to considerable lengths to prevent identification of the body by removing the most distinctive features. But where did those remains go? Were they destroyed somehow? Buried somewhere else? The answer to that question could provide crucial evidence about who was responsible. San Francisco police have denied Freedom of Information requests for details about the case, citing the ongoing investigation. They won't say how many calls they received from neighbors about Brian's disappearance. They won't release body camera footage from the welfare checks. Their position is that releasing this information could compromise the investigation. But to outside observers, to Brian's friends and family, the lack of progress is baffling. The evidence seems clear. Financial crimes were committed using Brian's identity. Someone used his debit card to buy a car, to hire a cleanup crew. Someone installed an answering machine and recorded fake messages. Someone dismembered his body and concealed it in chemicals. Lance Silva's possession of documents related to the car purchase, his presence in Brian's house during the time Brian was missing, his use of Brian's financial resources, all point toward his involvement. Yet 7 years later, he walks free. There are theories about what might have complicated the case. Some legal experts have suggested that the autopsy report's ambiguity about cause of death created challenges. Without being able to say definitively how Brian died, prosecutors might worry about a defense attorney arguing that Silva found Brian dead, panicked, and tried to dispose of the body, which would be a lesser crime than murder. Others have pointed to potential issues with how evidence was collected or preserved. The fact that police conducted 3 welfare checks without entering the home might have given people inside time to clean up or hide evidence. By the time police finally entered, crucial forensic material might have been compromised. There's also the question of whether there were more people involved than just Silva and McCaffrey. Brian was known for allowing homeless individuals to stay in his downstairs unit. Could someone else have been present when he died? Could there be witnesses who haven't come forward? Devin Egg, Brian's brother, has taken a surprisingly conciliatory tone when discussing the case. In interviews, he said he's not in a position to condemn the police, that he doesn't know if he could have done a better job. He's even said that if he can forgive Lance Silva, he can forgive the San Francisco Police Department for their mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, he said. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean the case should remain unsolved. The case has received renewed attention in recent years. Nancy Grace, the television legal commentator, investigated Brian's death for a Fox Nation streaming series. She was highly critical of how San Francisco police handled the welfare checks and the overall investigation. James Patterson, the famous author, featured the case in his Unsolved series, also on Fox Nation. Podcasts have covered the story. True crime YouTube channels have examined the evidence. Each time the case gets attention, there's a hope that maybe someone will come forward with new information, that maybe some detail will finally break the case open. Brian's neighbor and friend, Scott Free, who was among the first to raise alarms about Brian's disappearance, has faced his own tragedy in recent years. He suffered a cardiac event in 2023 after giving a tribute to another friend at the Castro Theater. Complications from that event led to a sepsis infection, which resulted in the amputation of both his hands and feet. He now lives in an assisted living facility in Rancho Mirage, near Palm Springs. Free, who performs as drag performer Pippi Lovestocking, has been the subject of a documentary about his life and challenges. But even dealing with his own difficulties, he's remained a voice calling for justice in Brian's case. The property where Brian lived, where he was killed, has been transformed. The developer who purchased it in 2019 moved forward with plans to build a multi-unit condominium complex called 224 Clara. During the redevelopment process, squatters temporarily took over the empty house, breaking windows, using the space for drug use, starting bonfires in the backyard. Neighbors complained to the city repeatedly before the building was finally demolished. Now, there's a modern building on that site. 9 condominium units, contemporary design, no trace of what came before. The palm trees Brian planted still grow on Clara Street. The neighbors who knew him are mostly still there. But the physical space where he lived, where he died, where he was hidden for months is gone. What remains is a question that hangs over everything. Why hasn't anyone been held accountable? There are technical legal answers to that question. Insufficient evidence. Ambiguous autopsy findings. Challenges in building a case that can survive defense scrutiny. These are real obstacles in the criminal justice system. But there's also a simpler answer, one that's harder to articulate but feels true to the people who knew Brian. It's about whose life is considered valuable, whose death demands justice, whose story matters. Brian Egg was 65 years old, living on the margins, no steady job, no wealth to speak of. He let homeless people stay in his house. He was part of San Francisco's gay community in an era when that meant something different than it does now. He was eccentric, private, not someone with political connections or social capital. Would the case have been handled differently if the victim had been someone else? If Brian had been wealthier, more connected, more conventional? It's impossible to know for sure, but it's a question his friends and neighbors have asked repeatedly. San Francisco police maintain that the investigation is active. They continue to ask anyone with information to come forward. They're particularly interested in hearing from business owners or anyone who may have been contacted by someone claiming to be Brian Egg, or who may have done business with someone using his identity. Perhaps someday someone will call. Perhaps someone who knows something will finally decide to speak. Perhaps there's evidence somewhere, preserved, waiting to be discovered. Perhaps forensic technology will advance in ways that allow re-examination of the remains or other physical evidence. Or perhaps this case will remain what it is now. A warning about how easily someone can disappear, even in a city surrounded by people who care. A story about missed opportunities and systemic failures. A reminder that justice isn't automatic, that it requires persistence and attention and resources. Brian Egg lived most of his life on Clara Street. He was generous with what little he had. He watered plants that didn't belong to him, planted trees for a future he wouldn't see, gave away coats to keep others warm. His neighbors remember him walking his dog every single day, a reliable presence in their lives. And then one spring, he stopped walking. And when people tried to find out why, when they called for help, when they raised alarms, it took months before anyone looked inside his house to see what had happened. By then, it was far too late. There's no neat resolution to this story. No courtroom scene where justice is served. No moment where everything makes sense. Just a man who lived quietly, who died violently, and whose case remains open, waiting for answers that may never come. On Clara Street, where palm trees still sway and neighbors still know each other, people remember Brian. They remember his kindness, his quirks, his presence, and they wonder, as anyone would, how this could have happened. How someone they saw every day could vanish so completely, even while his body remained just a few doors away. If you know anything about what happened to Brian Egg, police are still asking you to call. Even after all this time, even with all the complications and failures in this case, there's still hope that someone, somewhere, knows something that could finally bring resolution. Because Brian deserved better than this. He deserved to be safe in his own home. He deserved to have his concerns taken seriously when people first raised alarms. And he deserves justice even now, even years later. That's what remains at the center of this story. Not the gruesome details of how his body was found, not the legal technicalities that have prevented prosecution, but the simple truth that a person's life was taken, and no one has been held accountable. And until that changes, the case of Brian Egg will remain what it is. A quiet disappearance that became a tragedy, an investigation that became a frustration, and a life that deserved to be remembered for more than how it ended. So rest well, knowing that somewhere on a narrow alley in San Francisco, palm trees still grow because a man once thought the neighborhood would look nicer with them. And that's the kind of legacy worth carrying forward, even in the middle of an unsolved case. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 3. The Hunter on Interstate 71. For nearly a decade, someone moved through the darkness along America's highways, choosing victims from the most vulnerable. A voice on the CB radio, a silver truck with a red hood. Women who disappeared from parking lots and never came home. The man they came to call Dr. No left behind questions that would take decades to answer, and a trail that stretched across state lines. This is the story of how a ghost became a name, and how that name became Samuel Legg III. Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about a case that haunted the highways of the American Midwest for years. It's a story about patterns that emerged slowly, about lives that intersected in the worst possible ways, and about how technology finally caught up with someone who thought they disappeared into the vastness of the interstate system. Before we begin, a gentle reminder that this story involves real people who experienced real harm. We'll approach it with care, focusing on the investigation, the details that mattered, and the slow work of justice rather than dwelling on violence for its own sake. Some of you listening might find certain details difficult, and that's completely understandable. This is a story meant for quiet reflection, told in a way that respects both the gravity of what happened and your need for calm. So settle in, get comfortable, let the weight of the day fall away. We're going back to the 1980s, to a time when CB radios crackled across truck stop parking lots, when the interstate highway system was still relatively young, and when someone began using that vast network of roads to hide terrible secrets. In the early 1980s, the American interstate highway system was a world unto itself. Interstate 71 cut through the heart of Ohio, connecting Cleveland in the north to Cincinnati in the south, passing through smaller cities and countless rest stops along the way. It was a river of commerce, a pathway for long-haul truckers who spent days or weeks on the road, and for many people on the margins of society, it became a place of work and survival. The truck stops that dotted Interstate 71 were more than just places to refuel. They were communities of sorts, temporary meeting places where truckers could rest, eat, shower, and connect with others through CB radio channels. In those days before cell phones became ubiquitous, CB radios were the primary communication tool for drivers. Channels buzzed with chatter, handles or nicknames identified speakers, and relationships formed over invisible airwaves. Among the largest of these stops was the Union 76 in Austintown, Ohio, positioned east of Akron and west of Youngstown. This particular truck stop became known for more than its size. Women worked the parking lots there, offering services to drivers passing through. It was dangerous work, always had been. The women who did it knew the risks, but economic realities often left few choices. Most kept an informal network going, watching out for each other when they could, sharing information about which drivers to avoid. Samuel William Legg III was born in Ohio and came of age in the late 1970s. He was tall, sturdy in build, with dark hair and features some witnesses would later describe as possibly suggesting Middle Eastern descent, though this was likely just an impression formed from limited glimpses. He wore glasses sometimes. He spoke with what some remembered as a northeastern accent, though he'd spent most of his life in Ohio. By his early 20s, Legg had entered the trucking world. He drove long-haul routes through the Midwest and beyond, which meant spending long hours alone on highways, sleeping in his cab, living a transient existence. In 1989, when he was around 20 years old, he married a woman named Nancy Hicks in Elyria, Ohio. Nancy had a 14-year-old daughter named Angela from a previous relationship, and Legg became Angela's stepfather. The marriage showed strain from the beginning. Legg demonstrated what family members later described as inappropriate behavior toward Angela, and he had a tendency toward lying that created constant friction. Arguments between Legg and Nancy became frequent. Those who knew the family sensed something was wrong, though no one could quite articulate what. That same year, 1989, Legg was indicted in Lorain County on a theft charge. It was a minor offense, the kind of petty crime that often doesn't register as particularly significant. But it marked the beginning of what would become a pattern of brushes with the law, small enough that they never required him to submit DNA to any database, large enough to suggest someone whose relationship with rules and boundaries was complicated at best. Meanwhile, along Interstate 71, women were disappearing. The first case that authorities would eventually connect to what became known as the Dr. No murders occurred in April of 1981. A young woman's body was discovered in Miami County, Ohio. She died from strangulation after receiving a head injury. Her jeans and underwear were at her ankles, the upper parts of her clothing missing. The scene suggested she'd been thrown from a vehicle. Tire tracks in the grass supported this theory. The victim had distinctive tattoos and wore jewelry, details that should have made identification straightforward. But no one came forward to claim her. She remained nameless for nearly 3 decades, existing only as a Jane Doe in filing systems and the quiet thoughts of investigators who worked her case. It would be 2010 before relatives saw her tattoos listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System and recognized their lost family member, Paula Beverly Davis, who had been 21 years old when she died. For years past. Then, in June of 1985, 25-year-old Marcia Matthews, who went by the nickname Pepper, was found by a trucker about a mile from the Union 76 truck stop in Austintown. Unlike Paula Davis, Marcia was still alive when discovered, but barely. She'd been beaten severely in the head. Her skull was fractured. She was found alongside Interstate 71. Marcia worked the truck stops, communicating with potential clients over CB radio, a common practice at the time. Despite efforts to save her, Marcia died from her injuries. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though it would take time for investigators to see it clearly. Women connected to the truck stop economy, found near Interstate 71, beaten, often with clothing missing. Each case seemed to tell a similar story, but without witnesses or physical evidence that could lead to a suspect, the investigation stalled. In July of 1986, the body of 23-year-old Shirley Dean Taylor was discovered behind a traffic barrier on Interstate 71 in Medina County, about 100 miles from where Marcia Matthews had been found. Shirley had been beaten to death. Her jewelry and several pieces of clothing had been removed from her body. Before her disappearance, witnesses had seen her at the Union 76 truck stop, where she'd gone to meet a regular client. That client had a nickname, one that would eventually give this series of crimes its name. People called him Dr. No. The nickname was distinctive enough that investigators took note, but not distinctive enough to lead anywhere. When they looked into it, they found several truckers used that handle on the CB channels. It was perhaps a reference to the James Bond villain, or maybe just something that sounded mysterious and appealing. Either way, it became one of many dead ends in an investigation that was growing colder. December of 1986 brought another disappearance. April Barnett, 18 years old, went missing from the Union 76 truck stop. Her body was found a few days later, 70 miles away from Austintown. Like the others, she'd been beaten and strangled. Some of her clothes were missing. The pattern was undeniable now, but understanding a pattern and stopping it are two different things. A few days after April's body was discovered, 28-year-old Jill Allen was found murdered in Illinois, near Interstate 70. Though she'd been found in another state, investigators connected her death to the Ohio cases due to the striking similarities in method and presentation. Someone was moving through the region, selecting victims who shared certain vulnerabilities, and leaving their bodies to be found near the highways he traveled. Back in Elyria, in the Legg household, tensions had reached a breaking point. In July of 1990, Angela Hicks, now 14 years old, disappeared. Her mother Nancy reported her missing, but Samuel Legg told police that Angela was a runaway, that she'd left on her own. Nancy and Angela's friends questioned this immediately. All of Angela's clothes remained in the house, all her shoes, everything she would have taken if she'd planned to leave. But Samuel insisted on his version of events, his voice confident even as those around him expressed doubts. On August 30th, 1990, a terrible discovery confirmed what Nancy and Angela's friends had feared. Angela's body was found in a wooded area in Elyria. She'd been there for more than a month. Her remains were partially nude and badly decomposed. Police brought Samuel Legg in for questioning. He submitted to a polygraph test, but the results came back inconclusive. Without physical evidence linking him to his stepdaughter's death, and with only suspicions and inconsistencies in his story to work with, investigators couldn't bring charges. Angela's case went cold, her death officially unsolved. though those who knew the family never stopped believing they knew who was responsible. That same year, on April 19, 1990, another body was found behind a truck stop in Licking County, Ohio, about 25 miles east of Columbus. This victim was partially nude and had been beaten to death. Her jewelry and some articles of clothing were missing. Despite extensive investigation, she remained unidentified for years. Investigators eventually gave her a name for their files, the Hebron Jane Doe. It would be 2017 before she was identified as Patrice Corley. The highway killings seemed to stop around 1990 or 91, though investigators couldn't be sure. Had the killer moved to different hunting grounds, stopped entirely, died, or been imprisoned for unrelated crimes? These questions hung in the air as task forces formed and disbanded, as leads dried up, and as the cases gradually moved from active investigations to cold case files. What investigators didn't know was that Samuel Legg had continued driving his routes, continued his pattern of small criminal infractions that never quite rose to the level of serious consequence. In 1992, just 2 months after yet another body would be discovered at an Austintown truck stop, Legg was indicted in Lorain County on charges of receiving stolen property. He received probation. In 1994, his marriage to Nancy ended in divorce. He moved on, his life continuing in the shadows of America's highway system. By the early 1990s, law enforcement across Ohio had begun to recognize they were dealing with something larger than isolated incidents. A task force formed in 1991, dedicated specifically to what they were now calling the truck stop prostitute murders. The similarities were too consistent to ignore. Women who worked the truck stops, found near Interstate 71 or connected highways, beaten or strangled, often with items of clothing missing, particularly underwear and shoes. Investigators conducted thousands of interviews. They spoke with sex workers who worked the truck stops, asking about regular clients, about anyone who gave them bad feelings or who'd acted inappropriately. They interviewed truck stop employees, people who might have seen interactions in parking lots or noticed the same vehicle returning repeatedly. They questioned truck drivers themselves, trying to separate the vast majority who were simply doing their jobs from the one or few who might be responsible for these deaths. Witnesses began to provide a description, though it was frustratingly vague. The man they were looking for was tall, large in build, with fair skin and dark hair. He wore glasses. His age was estimated anywhere from 25 to 40 years old, a range so broad it encompassed thousands of potential suspects. He drove what witnesses described as a 1984 silver truck with a wind deflector and a distinctive red hood. Some said it might have been pulling a refrigerated trailer. The CB handles associated with the suspect expanded beyond Dr. No. Some witnesses mentioned hearing or speaking with someone who used the handle stargazer. Others said they'd heard the name Dragon. Whether these were all the same person using different names or multiple individuals was unclear. The investigation was drowning in possibilities, each lead branching into dozens more, most going nowhere. In 1991, investigators thought they might have found their man. Alvin Wilson, a 36-year-old truck driver originally from Lake County, Ohio, became a prime suspect. Strands of his hair had been found on some of the victims. Credit card receipts placed him in the same areas as 3 of the Ohio murders at the times they occurred. The boyfriend and pimp of April Barnett, who'd been murdered in December of 1986, had reported Wilson's license plate to police, saying something about him seemed wrong. Wilson had also committed a violent crime that matched the pattern. In October of 1989, he'd assaulted and attempted to murder a woman. After his arrest for that attack, another young woman from Akron came forward, claiming Wilson had picked her up for sex, but then beat her and tried to strangle her. Everything seemed to point toward Wilson as the Dr. No killer. But then investigators hit a wall. When they checked Wilson's whereabouts more carefully, they discovered he'd been in jail during some of the killings. It was impossible for him to be responsible for all the murders, which meant either they were dealing with multiple killers working independently, or Wilson wasn't their man. Despite the compelling circumstantial evidence, they had to look elsewhere. Wilson was later convicted of the 1989 attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison, but the Dr. No cases remained unsolved. On April 9, 1992, a woman's fully clothed body was discovered near a parking lot by the Universal Truck Mall in Austintown, on Interstate 80 near Route 46. She died from multiple blunt force injuries to the head, face, and chest. The brutality of the attack spoke to rage, or to someone who'd lost all sense of the victim as a human being. She became another Jane Doe, another file with more questions than answers. Her fingerprints didn't match anyone in the system. No missing persons report seemed to fit. She remained nameless for more than 2 decades. What investigators didn't know was that Samuel Legg had been in the area around that time. He was still driving his truck routes, still moving through the network of truck stops and rest areas. Just 2 months after this body was discovered, in the heat of the investigation into her death, Legg was indicted again in Lorain County on receiving stolen property charges. He received probation once more. The pattern of small offenses continued, each one below the threshold that would have required him to provide DNA to any database. The investigation into the truck stop murders cast a wide net. Authorities recognized that if they were dealing with a truck driver, the crimes could extend beyond Ohio's borders. They posted over 4,000 photographs of the victims and composite sketches of the possible suspect at 130 truck stops and service stations across Ohio. They expanded the campaign to 1,350 truck stops in 9 other states through which the suspected killer might travel. They offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Despite this massive effort, meaningful leads remained scarce. Several other suspects emerged and were investigated. John Fortenberry, arrested in 1991 for a series of 5 murders that had taken place in Oregon, New Jersey, Ohio, and Alaska, briefly became a person of interest. After his capture, he confessed to a 6th murder in 1984. But Fortenberry's victim profile was all wrong. He targeted male truck drivers, befriending them before robbing and killing them. He was executed in 2009. His name cleared from the Dr. No investigation. In 1994, investigators looked at James Robert Cruz Jr., a 36-year-old trucker and Ohio native. Cruz was convicted that year of raping and strangling 17-year-old Dawn Marie Birnbaum, whose body had been found near State Route 26 in Spring Township in March of 1993. The method bore some similarities to the Dr. No murders, but investigators couldn't definitively link him to the other cases. Sean Patrick Goebel, a 28-year-old truck driver from North Carolina, appeared on investigators' radars in 1995. Goebel was suspected of killing a North Carolina woman and 2 sex workers in Tennessee, and he was a person of interest in killings across 10 states. He seemed like a strong candidate for the Dr. No murders. But when investigators looked more closely at the timeline, they realized Goebel was too young to have committed the earliest crimes. He was still in high school in 1981 when the first suspected victim was killed. The Army had stationed him out of state during the mid-'80s, ruling him out for murders occurring during that time frame. In 2005, DNA profiling identified another truck-driving serial killer, Delmas Colvin, who was 46 years old at the time of his arrest. For a moment, investigators wondered if they'd finally found Dr. No. But again, the connections didn't hold up under scrutiny. Colvin's crimes and patterns didn't match closely enough with the Ohio cases. The investigation was complicated by a grim reality that law enforcement had to acknowledge. When they looked at the broader picture of unsolved murders involving sex workers near truck stops and interstate highways during the 1980s and 90s, the numbers were staggering. Authorities found as many as 150 other homicides nationwide that fit similar patterns. The truck stop economy, the transient nature of both workers and drivers, and the limitations of law enforcement coordination across jurisdictions created an environment where predators could operate with relative impunity. Meanwhile, Samuel Legg's life continued to unfold in ways that, in retrospect, carried their own significance. In 1997, a Cuyahoga County grand jury indicted him on receiving stolen property charges. He received 1 year of probation. Just 3 months into that probation period, in September of '97, something happened that would eventually become crucial to the investigation, though no one knew it at the time. A 17-year-old girl was hitchhiking from Cleveland to her home in Lexington, Ohio, after visiting her boyfriend. Samuel Legg, driving his truck route, picked her up. According to what the girl would later tell investigators, Legg drove her to a truck stop in southern Medina County and raped her there. The girl reported the assault, and detectives investigated. They identified Legg as a suspect, but concerns arose about the victim's credibility in ways that reflected the era's often dismissive attitude toward young women and sex crimes. Despite the girl's consistent account, prosecutors decided not to file charges. Legg walked away, the rape kit and evidence filed away, waiting. That same year, in October, another body turned up. Julie and Conkle, 39 years old, was found strangled behind an abandoned truck stop called Centers, located at Russell Road and Old Route 41 in Russell, near the Illinois border with Wisconsin. Julie had apparently been living in her old, rusted-out van, working at various truck stops washing trucks. She had an arrest record for deceptive practice and forgery. When her body was found, she was fully clothed, lying atop a pile of dirt. Her fingerprints allowed authorities to identify her, but identifying a victim and finding their killer are two different challenges. Less than 2 months later, on December 20th, 1996, a frozen body was discovered behind the Union 76 truck stop in Stony Ridge, in Wood County, Ohio. The victim was nude, lying in the winter cold. She was quickly identified as Victoria Jane Collins, 27 years old. Victoria worked as an exotic dancer and had been arrested several times, making identification straightforward. Initially, her death was ruled as cardiac arrest due to drugs and alcohol found in her system. But as investigators looked more closely, they revised their conclusion. Victoria had been raped and murdered. Someone had left her body in a place where it would be found, but that someone had left no obvious calling card, no clear trail to follow. These cases from 96 and 97 would later prove crucial, but at the time, they were just more entries in a growing file of unsolved murders. Samuel Legg, meanwhile, had moved to Arizona sometime around 2000 or 2001. His interaction with the court system went mostly quiet, aside from his third and fourth marriages, both of which ended in divorce within 2 years, and an arrest in October 2001 for failing to pay child support. He received probation. Forensic science advanced dramatically in the years following the initial wave of murders. DNA technology, which had been in its infancy during the 1980s, became increasingly sophisticated. Law enforcement agencies across the country began to recognize the potential of cold case investigations powered by new DNA analysis techniques. Evidence that had been collected decades earlier, stored carefully in evidence rooms, could now yield information that wasn't possible to extract when it was first gathered. In 2006, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation made a significant discovery. DNA evidence from 2 crime scenes, the 1996 murder of Victoria Collins in Wood County and a 1997 killing in Illinois involving Julie Conkle, came back as a match. The same person had been at both scenes. This wasn't proof of a serial killer yet, but it was a connection, a thread that could potentially be followed. 6 years later, in 2012, investigators added another case to this DNA link. The unidentified woman who'd been found at the Austintown truck stop in April of 1992, beaten to death near the Universal Truck Mall, had DNA on her body that matched the same profile from the Collins and Conkle murders. 3 murders spanning 5 years, from Ohio to Illinois, all connected through forensic evidence. Someone had left traces of themselves at these scenes, traces that were waiting for the right technology and the right investigation to bring them into the light. But DNA evidence alone isn't enough if there's no one to compare it to. The profile sat in databases waiting for a match that never came. The person responsible had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA submission. Or if they had, it was before such databases existed or in a jurisdiction that didn't participate in DNA collection programs. The investigation entered a new kind of limbo, one where they knew more than ever but still couldn't identify a suspect. In 2013, the Austintown Jane Doe finally received a name. Advances in identification techniques and the growing databases of missing persons information allowed investigators to match her to a woman who'd been missing since 1989. Sharon Lynn Kadzierski, 43 years old when she died, had last been seen alive in Miami Lakes, Florida, in October of '89. Somehow, she'd ended up more than 1,000 miles away in Ohio, where she'd met a brutal end at a truck stop in April of '92. Her former husband told reporters she'd worked as a bookkeeper and in income tax preparation in Pembroke Pines, Florida. No one had any explanation for why she'd been in Ohio or how she'd come to be at that truck stop. With Sharon now identified, investigators renewed their efforts on her case. But years had passed, witnesses had scattered or died, and memories had faded. Still, the DNA connection meant that whoever had killed Sharon had also killed Victoria and Julie. It was something solid to work with, even if the path forward remained unclear. The breakthrough that would finally crack these cases came from a technique that was still relatively new and controversial in law enforcement: familial DNA searching. This process works by taking DNA from an unknown offender and searching databases not for an exact match, but for close genetic relatives. The logic is straightforward. If you can't find the person, maybe you can find their cousin, their uncle, their nephew. From there, traditional investigative work can build family trees and narrow down suspects. Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation had used familial DNA searching only a handful of times, and only when all other investigative leads had been exhausted and there was a significant public safety concern. The Dr. No cases, with their multiple victims and decades of unanswered questions, certainly qualified. When they ran the DNA profile through this process, they got a hit. Not a direct match, but close enough to suggest a family connection. Investigators worked carefully from this point. They constructed family trees, traced lineages, and looked for men of the right age who might fit the profile. The trail led them to an individual living in Arizona. Samuel William Legg III, a former truck driver who'd spent years operating in the Midwest, came into focus. In January of 2019, Medina County Prosecutor Forrest Thompson and a detective from the Sheriff's Department flew to Arizona. Legg was living in a group home in Chandler, a facility for people with mental health needs. When they found him, he was in a fragile state, his mental condition obviously deteriorating. But they explained why they were there, and they asked him for a DNA sample. Legg provided it. Perhaps he didn't fully understand what was happening. Perhaps he did and simply couldn't resist anymore. Either way, the sample was obtained legally and sent for analysis. The results came back definitive. Samuel Legg's DNA matched the profile from the Victoria Collins murder, the Julie Konkle murder, and the Sharon Kadzierski murder. After decades of investigation, thousands of interviews, multiple false leads and dead ends, they finally had their man. In February of 2019, Legg was extradited from Arizona to Ohio to face charges. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Samuel Legg III stood before a judge in Medina County on charges stemming from the 1997 rape of the 17-year-old girl, the assault that had been investigated but never prosecuted. 22 years after the crime, with new technology and renewed determination, prosecutors filed 2 counts of rape. Legg pleaded not guilty. The judge set bail at $1 million and ordered that Legg undergo evaluation to determine if he was competent to stand trial. Hours after that arraignment, a Mahoning County grand jury indicted Legg on charges of aggravated murder in connection with Sharon Kadzierski's death. Over the following months, additional indictments came. Wood County indicted him for the murder of Victoria Collins. Lake County, Illinois, indicted him for the murder of Julie Konkle, with bail set at $3 million. DNA evidence linked him definitively to all these cases, crimes spanning from 92 to 97, across 2 states, all involving women found at or near truck stops. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost spoke publicly about the case, stating plainly that it was fair to call Samuel Legg a serial killer. The question wasn't whether Legg had killed these women. The DNA evidence was clear. The question was how many others might be connected to him, and whether he would ever stand trial for any of them. Elyria police reopened the investigation into Angela Hicks's death, the 14-year-old stepdaughter whose body had been found in 1990. Nicole Myers, who'd been Angela's best friend, spoke to reporters about the decades of waiting, the decades of knowing in her heart who was responsible but having no way to prove it. She'd gone on with her life, married, had children, built a family, but part of her had remained frozen in that summer of 1990, waiting for answers. As investigators looked more closely at Leg's life and travel patterns, they began to suspect there might be more victims beyond the ones they could definitively connect through DNA. Leg had been a long-haul trucker for years, traveling across multiple states. The original Dr. No investigation had identified at least 10 potential victims in Ohio alone between 81 and 90. The first victim, Paula Beverly Davis, found in 81, predated the DNA-linked murders by more than a decade. Marcia Matthews, found in 85, had died before the confirmed timeline as well. Were these also Leg's victims? Without DNA evidence or other definitive proof, it was impossible to say with certainty. The picture that emerged of Samuel Legg's final years before arrest was troubling in a different way from his crimes. Starting around 2015 or 16, people began encountering him in states of severe mental distress. Deputies in Arizona found him multiple times, sunburned and blistered, talking to no one, disoriented and delusional. He would walk aimlessly for hours through rural areas and campgrounds, speaking rapidly about nothing coherent, changing topics mid-sentence. When officers tried to talk to him, he'd give contradictory explanations for why he was there or what he was doing. In January 2015, he was arrested on counts of failure to appear and trespassing in Tucson Municipal Court. He received probation, but his mental condition continued to deteriorate. He ended up living in group homes designed for people with complex mental health needs. Police considered him a danger to himself, noting that he heard voices in his head that instructed him on what to do. The man who might have terrorized women for years had become someone who could barely care for himself, his mind fragmenting under the weight of time or illness or perhaps the burden of what he'd done. When Samuel Legg stood before judges in multiple jurisdictions in 2019, the legal system faced a challenging question. Legg was clearly not in a state to participate meaningfully in his own defense. He was confused, often manic, unable to maintain coherent conversation. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and determined that his mental state had deteriorated significantly. In May of 2019, a judge in Mahoning County ordered Legg to undergo treatment at Twin Valley Behavioral Health Center in Columbus, Ohio, a maximum security facility. The goal was to restore him to competency, to bring him to a mental state where he could understand the charges against him and assist his attorneys in mounting a defense. The judge gave prosecutors a 4-month window initially, with the timeline later extended. But as months turned into years, it became increasingly clear that Legg might never be competent to stand trial. Multiple forensic psychiatric evaluations came to the same conclusion. Whatever was happening in Legg's mind, whether it was long-standing mental illness, the effects of age, or something else entirely, had progressed beyond the point where treatment could reliably restore him to competency. He remains at Twin Valley Behavioral Health Center, involuntarily committed, not permitted to leave, but also not convicted of any of the murders to which DNA evidence links him. This outcome represents a particular kind of frustration for the families of victims. Julie Konkel's family, Victoria Collins's mother, Sharon Kadzierski's relatives, the 17-year-old girl who reported being raped in 97 and wasn't believed, all of them have answers now in terms of who was responsible. The DNA evidence is clear, but they don't have the formal closure that comes with a trial, a verdict, a sentence. They don't have the opportunity to face Legg in court, to hear him answer for what he did, to watch as the justice system formally recognizes their loved one's suffering. For Angela Hicks's family, the situation is even more uncertain. Elyria police reopened the investigation into her murder, but as of the most recent reports, no charges have been filed in her case. DNA evidence has not been publicly confirmed as linking Legg to Angela's death, though he was one of the last people to see her alive and remains the primary suspect. Nicole Myers, Angela's best friend, continues to wait for the day when someone will finally be held accountable for cutting Angela's life short. The question of how many women Samuel Legg killed remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The 4 murders confirmed through DNA, Victoria Collins, Julie Konkel, Sharon Kadzierski, and potentially the 1997 Medina County rape victim if she had died, represent only what can be definitively proven. But investigators have suggested there may be more cases connected to him. Some of the earlier Dr. No murders might be his work. His stepdaughter's death likely was. Other unsolved cases from his years driving trucks across the Midwest might also bear his mark. Attorney General Yost mentioned when announcing Legg's arrest that investigators were working with law enforcement agencies across the country to track down Legg's crimes. The publicity surrounding his case was expected to attract attention from agencies with similar unsolved slayings. Some of those connections may have been made, though if so, they haven't been publicly disclosed, perhaps due to the ongoing nature of investigations or the complexity of proving cases decades after the fact. The interstate highway system, which provided the backdrop for these crimes, remains what it's always been: a vital artery of American commerce and travel, a pathway connecting cities and communities, and unfortunately, a landscape that can facilitate predation. The vulnerability of certain populations, particularly those engaged in survival sex work, hasn't disappeared. Neither has the transient nature of trucking, which allows individuals to move through communities without establishing the kinds of connections that might make them accountable to anyone. What has changed is the power of forensic science and the willingness of law enforcement to dedicate resources to cold cases. The familial DNA technique that led to Legg's identification has been used in other major cases and represents a powerful tool for justice. But it also raises privacy questions and ethical concerns about when and how such techniques should be employed. Ohio has used it sparingly, only in cases involving serious crimes and public safety threats where all traditional investigative methods have been exhausted. The name Dr. No, which once represented an unknown threat haunting the highways, is now attached to a face and a history. Samuel Legg III, a man whose life intersected with tragedy in ways both inflicted and experienced. A man who drove trucks across the Midwest, who married and divorced multiple times, who committed petty crimes that never quite rose to the level of serious consequences, who may have killed his stepdaughter, who definitely killed at least 3 women and raped at least 1 girl, and whose mind eventually deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function independently. There's no satisfying conclusion to this story because it hasn't really concluded. Legg remains at Twin Valley Behavioral Health Center, neither free nor convicted, existing in a legal limbo that frustrates everyone seeking closure. The families of victims must live with the knowledge that justice, in its traditional form, may never arrive. Investigators continue to work on connecting dots, identifying other possible victims, but those cases may remain forever uncertain. In February of 2013, years before anyone knew who was responsible, Sharon Kadzierski was finally identified after more than 2 decades as a Jane Doe. In 2017, the Hebron Jane Doe was identified as Patrice Corley. In 2010, the first suspected Dr. No victim from 1981 was identified as Paula Beverly Davis. These identifications mattered immensely to families who'd lived with absence and uncertainty, even if they couldn't bring prosecutions. At least the women had their names back, their identities restored, their stories acknowledged. The truck stops along Interstate 71 continue to operate. The Union 76 in Austintown, where so many of the victims were last seen, remains a fixture for truckers and travelers. Life continues, commerce flows, people move through the landscape just as they always have. But for those who know the history, who remember the investigations and the vigils and the hope that one day the truth would emerge, these places carry a weight of memory. Samuel Legg III is now in his mid-50s, living out his days in a secure facility, his connection to reality tenuous at best. Whether he remembers what he did, whether he feels remorse, whether he has moments of clarity in which the full weight of his actions becomes apparent to him, these questions have no public answers. The families of his victims don't have access to his internal experience, and it's unclear whether they would want it if they did. What remains is a story about vulnerability and predation, about how the margins of society can become hunting grounds, about the limitations of law enforcement in protecting those who exist outside traditional community structures, and about the slow, painstaking work of seeking justice even when decades have passed. It's a story about how scientific advances can change what's possible in solving crimes, but also about how mental illness and legal incompetency can prevent the satisfying conclusion of a trial and conviction. For the victims, Victoria Collins, who worked as a dancer, Julie Conkle, who was living in her van and working at truck stops, Sharon Kadzierski, whose journey from Florida to Ohio remains mysterious, Angela Hicks, who was just 14 years old, and all the others whose names we may or may not know, justice remains incomplete. Their lives mattered, their deaths deserve accountability, but the systems designed to provide that accountability have limits. The story of Dr. No and Samuel Legg III is ultimately a story without an ending, or at least without the ending anyone hoped for. The investigation succeeded in identifying a killer. Forensic science worked exactly as it should. Dedicated law enforcement professionals pursued leads across decades until they found answers. But those answers led to someone who can't be tried, can't be sentenced, and may never face the full consequences of his actions in any formal sense. This is the uncomfortable reality of some true crime stories. Not all of them end with courtroom drama and sentences handed down. Sometimes they end with an elderly person in a secure mental health facility, their mind too deteriorated to stand trial, and families who must find their own ways to process grief and seek peace without the framework of legal resolution. The highways of America continue to stretch across the landscape, connecting communities, facilitating commerce, providing pathways for millions of people going about their lives. The vulnerability that made certain populations targets hasn't disappeared, though awareness has increased and resources for investigation have improved. The memory of what happened along Interstate 71 in the 1980s and 90s serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, of protecting the vulnerable, and of never giving up on seeking answers even when decades have passed. For those who loved the victims, the acknowledgement of what happened, the identification of who was responsible, provides something even if it's not everything they deserved. At least the truth is known. At least their loved ones are no longer Jane Does or unsolved mysteries. At least the person who took them from the world has been identified and will never be free again, even if he'll also never face a jury. And perhaps that's all that's possible sometimes. Not perfect justice, but some measure of truth. Not complete closure, but at least an end to the worst of the uncertainty. Not everything anyone wanted, but something nonetheless. The story of Dr. No is now the story of Samuel Legg III, a name and a face where once there was only a shadow on the highways. And for the families of his victims, that knowledge, incomplete as it is, represents the closest thing to justice they may ever receive. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.